Welcome to the Best Interest Podcast, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello and welcome to episode 92 of the Best Interest Podcast. My name is Jesse Kramer. Later in today's episode, Dan Otter from 403 Wise will be joining us. And yes, if you're familiar with Dan or 403 Wise, that does mean that today's episode is targeted toward public school teachers here in America. And you might be thinking, well, that's not me. I'm not a public school teacher. This doesn't apply to me. But before you go, I want to say this. First, I think you'll find Dan very interesting and informative today. Whether you're a teacher or not, his passion, it comes through the microphone so well. You'll just find him easy to listen to and you'll learn something from Dan. And second, if you're like me, you can rattle off 5 or 10 or 20 close contacts in your life who are teachers, who do work as public school teachers, or maybe they're married to a teacher or they have children who are teachers. In fact, there are more than 3 million public school teachers in the U.S. today. Give this episode a listen, and as you do, I think you'll become appropriately aggravated by the current nature of the teacher's 403B system, and then you might feel motivated to send this episode to the educators, to the teachers in your life who you care about, and I think you'll be doing them a huge favor by doing so. But first, let's do a customary review of the week. This one comes from USAF Perio, who left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and said, refreshing and easy to listen to. Although there are many dozens upon dozens of finance and investing podcasts out there, Jesse's is refreshingly easy to listen to. The wisdom he shares is often on topics I've heard many, many times before, yet his perspective and the method he uses to explain topics simply makes them easier to understand. When it comes to teaching, he's a natural. Well, how appropriate, USAF Perio. Thank you for the teaching compliment. I take a lot of pride in that, as you'll hear me say at least once, maybe even twice throughout this episode today. Both my parents were public school teachers. That's part of the reason why I wanted to record this episode today. I think that's probably part of the reason why the teaching gene, if you will, maybe the apple hasn't fallen too far from the tree in terms of my ability to teach. I find it very fun to teach. Part of the reason why I'm here in the first place. Well, before Dan joins us today, I want to read to you from a 2022 article I wrote called Teachers Are Getting Taken Advantage of. At the time when I wrote this article, I had just sat down with actually one of my former teachers. He and I, it's funny, we met at a bar, we had a couple beers, and there on the table between us were his Ameriprise statements. Ameriprise is, what would you call them? Maybe like a chain financial advisor. And again, maybe I'm a little bit biased here, but I think if you were to poll the public, if you were to poll the personal finance and investing community, Ameriprise does not have a very golden reputation. And this gentleman who I was meeting with, his wife is also an educator. Happens a lot where you have a married couple, they're both educators, because it's probably how they met in the first place. And these two people, they each had a Roth IRA. Those IRAs were composed of 16 total mutual funds. And you say, well, why 16? And because, well, that's what their advisor at the time had recommended to them. And as I went through the statements, the majority of those funds, 11 of the 16 funds, had a 5.75% front load, which means that every dollar that they would contribute into those funds, immediately 5.75% would get taken off the top, an immediate haircut. If you know anything about fees, you know that that is pretty crazy. All of the funds, all 16 of the funds had a 12B1 fee, which sometimes is also called a marketing fee. Essentially, it's a bloated fee that's not necessary at all. Many of the common index funds that we either talk about here on the Best Interest Podcast that you've heard of through your own research that you've done elsewhere, very rarely do those types of funds have 12B1 fees. A 12B1 fee is just a because we can fee. We're going to charge you 0.25% simply because we can. And then when we added up the average dollar-weighted expense ratios of these two portfolios that I was looking at, the total expense ratio was 1.17%, which, as we know, 1.17% on your portfolio fees. That's much higher than it needs to be. Their total portfolio was about 10% cash. And this is in their Roth IRAs, 10% cash, 40% fixed income, and the other 50% being stocks, equities. But that's 10% cash and 40% fixed income, despite them being part of the terrific New York State teachers retirement system, a pension the best kind of fixed income out there. You'll hear me say this throughout this article. You'll probably hear me and Dan talk about it. If you're already getting Social Security and you're already getting a pension, you probably don't need much more fixed income in your portfolio. So I went through and step by step, and I explained to this former teacher of mine some of the problems that I saw and how to fix them. For example, there's no reason to be paying front loads. There's no reason to be paying 12B1 fees because there are too many great alternatives out there that don't have those fees. There's no reason to be paying a 1% expense ratio for a simple stock, bond, mutual fund portfolio because, again, there are too many great alternatives out there that can provide the same exact asset class exposure for much, much lower fees. And for retirement-specific savings, there's rarely a reason for teachers, for educators, to hold fixed income investments such as bonds, cash, or annuities because their pensions and because Social Security are already covering a lot of any fixed income need from their future retirement cash flow. For any of you listening right now, or for teachers specifically if you're listening, if your current advisor, a 403B advisor, isn't willing to listen to those facts and fix your portfolio, you should probably dump them like a bad prom date. Vanguard, Fidelity, Schwab have amazing investing options with expense ratios, 0.1% or less, 0.2% maybe, and there are very rarely any sort of extra fees involved there. At the time I originally wrote this article, this had been the fourth educator that I'd sat down with in basically a year and a half for a similar portfolio rescue. And 4 of those 4 educators, they were egregious examples of a bad portfolio. And in my opinion, sure, you can call it a biased opinion, but of bad advising. As I already mentioned once today, both my parents were teachers. So, like Michael Jordan in that Chicago Bulls documentary, I took that personally. I'm going to link in the show notes a terrific video that I linked in the original article from Tony Isola. It's called The 10 Rules for Retirement Investing, specifically for teachers. And the fact of the matter is, teachers, educators are getting taken advantage of. They have some amazing benefits in their life, like summers off, like their pensions. In many cases, their health care can be fantastic, like sterling, so good. But their retirement investing world is actually the opposite of amazing. It's infamously predatory. Their 403B programs introduce them to suboptimal advisors, salesmen, whatever you want to call them, who too often guide the teachers into poor investments. Now, why is that the case? Well, because those poor investments usually come with very high fees, as we've already discussed, and that means high commissions for the advisors. Generally, in these cases, what's bad for the teacher is good for the advisor. What's bad for the advisor is probably what's good for the teacher. That's how the advisors are getting paid. It's a nasty incentive system, and we'll quote Charlie Munger here again, one of our favorite people to quote, who said, "Show me the incentives, and I'll show you the outcome." When the incentives are set up against the teacher, but for the advisor in those cases, that's probably what's going to happen unless the teachers are armed with the knowledge of something better. As we'll allude to with Dan today, as you'll hear me and Dan talk about, there's a terrific article from the New York Times. It was actually a many-part article, which we will link in the show notes today, that shows just how predatory the teacher financial advisor landscape really can be. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Every week, I send a quick free email to thousands of readers that shares 3 simple things. 1, my new articles and podcasts. 2, the best financial content of the week from all over the internet. And 3, a financial chart that explains some important concept in the news that week. It's a great primer to boost your financial know-how.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
Well, this might not be for you. But I do hear you, which is why I make it very short, sweet, and full of only the essentials. A whopping 66% of subscribers read my email at least once a month. They're enjoying it, and maybe you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog. Again, that's a free, no-strings-attached subscription at bestinterest.blog. I don't want to steal too much of Dan's thunder today, so Dan Otter, along with his business partner John Moore, were 2 educators who got fed up with the lack of objective 403B information available to participants. So way back in 2000, they started a website called 403B Wise, which is an amazing resource for teachers out there to learn more about their specific 403Bs and what they can do to optimize, improve not only their 403B, but their entire financial ecosystem as teachers. And Dan is also the author of a book called Teach and Retire Rich, which lays out exactly how educators can reap the intrinsic and extrinsic rewards of the teaching profession. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dan Otter here onto the Best Interest Podcast. Well, Dan, thank you for joining us today. And I figure maybe we can start with the basics, just set a little bit of foundation. I have a feeling that most of our listeners today are familiar with the concept of a 401k. They might not be as familiar with a 403b, although perhaps there's some comparing and contrasting we can do between those two accounts. But let's just dive in. What exactly is a 403b account? Who is it for? Does it make sense to compare it to a 401k?
Great question, Jesse. Well, I'm an old teacher, and one of my favorite tools was the Venn diagram. You know, you put two things side by side. What are the differences? What are the similarities? And what you would find is a big chunk of the middle being very similar. They're almost identical. I mean, they share two numbers, right? The 4 and the 0. The big difference with the K-12 403b, and I have to differentiate, 403bs themselves come in different flavors. So if you are a public school teacher, that's the audience we serve. You have a governmental 403b. Jesse, the big difference is the K-12 403b does not enjoy federal fiduciary protections that the 401k does. You probably know this term, probably many in your audience, ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which protects participants in 401k plans. So if you work for an employer that offers a 401k, chances are they're pretty decent options, one vendor. Completely different world with the K-12 403b. The town I live in, Redlands, California, if you're a teacher in this town, you have more than 40 different financial companies to wade through. And Jesse, as a financial planner, you could probably only recommend a couple of these. The rest are high cost, sales agent sold, fees of 2 to 3%. And not only that, surrender charges that could cost you 6-7% of the balance. So that's the big difference between the 401k and the 403b.
So let's dive into that a little bit. Let's peel back that onion. So maybe we can start with the 40 different options in Redlands, California, or, you know, we were talking before recording here that you had some Western New York connections here, Dan, and I've got some Western New York connections where whether it's a teacher or a superintendent or a principal who's asked me to come into their school, speak to their teachers. So I've got to look at some of the 403b plans and the various financial firms that offer their services through the 403b plans. What kind of offerings are we talking about here? Maybe can we go through maybe the good, the bad, and the ugly that you've seen?
Absolutely. And in fact, what we've done is we have created a database of plan vendors, and we rate them actually, Jesse. We use a simple traffic light system: red light, green light, yellow light. Red, stop, don't use. Yellow, caution, might be okay. Green, go, good. So we'll start with the good. If you have Fidelity or Vanguard available, go. Those are our highest rated companies. Those are the financial companies my partner and I invest with. That is great. Unfortunately, it's rare to find Fidelity and Vanguard in a 403b vendor list. There's a company called Aspire, which is very interesting. We consider them like almost like a supermarket, where you walk into the supermarket and there's 10 different kinds of breads. This would be access to hundreds of different financial companies. And the good news is you have access to our two favorite companies that I just mentioned, Fidelity and Vanguard. I think there's an additional fee of 0.15%, which again, as a planner, you'd love to not have to pay that, but compare it to our red vendors. Probably one of the most egregious is Equitable. They're available in about every vendor list, every school district in the country. They're charging north of 2%, plus they're imposing surrender charges. So let's say you're a teacher, you're listening to this podcast, you go back and look at your 403b, oh no, I've got Equitable. Not only have you been paying more than 2%, if you want to get out of this product, you're going to have to pay 3, 4, 5, 6% of your balance. So on 403b wise, go to our vendor rating tool and you will see these companies grouped into these different buckets. And what's funny and actually kind of horrifying as an educator, basically, if it's a former president is in the name, like Lincoln, stay away. I mean, that is probably a general rule of thumb.
Equitable, formerly known as AXA.
Yep.
Is that correct? Right,
Yeah.
right. And so the stories that I've heard from my parents, who are both public school teachers here in New York, or other teachers, is that it tends to not be the Vanguards or Fidelities of the world, but maybe you can prove me wrong, Dan. I'm really looking to lean on your expertise. One of the unfortunate things about the 403B program, it seems, is that some of these advisors, likely advisors who are yellow or red light advisors, are in the schools themselves at time. You know, they're in the break room. I call them the donut people. They're showing up in the break room with the free donuts to start the conversations with the teachers, whereas maybe the green light companies are not necessarily doing that.
100%. Yeah, in order to keep the fees low, Vanguard is not going to send a sales agent to Rochester City Public Schools and have that person sit in the staff lounge to sell a index fund charging 0.02%. It just doesn't happen. Several dynamics at play here. Teachers, such a busy job. There's so many facets to being an educator. And so you can understand that they don't have time to become experts. So picture this, and this is what I experienced. You're a first-year teacher, you're exhausted, you walk into the staff lounge. There's a person there in a suit with free food. You reference these lunchroom people, and he or she says that they can help you with your financial future. And you're thinking, well, there's no way my school district would let just anyone walk into the staff lounge. I'm sure that they are vetted by the school district, and nothing could be further from the case. There's this illusion of vetting. And also, these sales agents will send emails that are very misleading. They'll say, Jesse, you're eligible to meet with a financial professional. Boy, that sure sounds like a benefit, doesn't it? So they skirt the line. They're not certified financial planners. They're not fiduciaries. And again, many of them are good people. Many educators establish relationships with these people, and many educators save money they might not have saved if they hadn't met these individuals. But here's what we always tell teachers. Would you rather have $800,000 in your 403B in retirement or $500,000 in your 403B retirement? To me, the answer is clear. $300,000 means I can visit my grandkids, I can take more trips, I can repair the house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Let's dive into some of the, we already talked about surrender charges as being one of the downsides that some of these yellow or red plans have, or I should say, financial firms have compared to the Vanguards or Fidelities of the world. But then also, isn't it fair to say that there's somewhat of an annuity focus in 403B land? I mean, what is going on there? What exactly am I referring to for the listeners who are unaware? And is that good or bad for participants?
Well, as my partner, Scott Downhour, always says, annuities aren't good or bad. It's the products that used within the annuities that can be good and can be bad. And you have to go back in history, and this is a surprise to a lot of people. The 403B predates the 401k by over 20 years. It was established way back in 1958, whereas the 401k was 1978. So up until 1974, which is a heck of a long time ago, I think if I'm right, Nixon or Ford was the president then, so we're going way back. Up until that point, people investing in a 403B could only invest in annuity products, insurance-based products. That changed in 1974 when paragraph 7 was added, allowing direct investment in mutual funds. That legacy continues. It continues not only in the staff lounges where sales agents are selling fixed annuities and variable annuities. Fixed annuities in many ways are just like simple CDs. Unfortunately, the insurance industry has taken the simple fixed annuity and they've layered on complexity, bonus annuities, equity indexed annuities. These are probably the most pernicious of all products because the sales pitch is, how would you, Jesse, like the upside of the market without the downside?
Give me heaven, don't give me hell.
Sign me up. I will take that all day long. It is false. You're going to get the minimum return and pay maximum in fees. And here's the other thing. They'll say, oh, there's no fee in this product. Technically, they're correct because it's a spread product like a CD. You know, they might earn 5%, they give you 3%, they're making 2% on this. Now, you look at the variable annuities, these are insurance plus mutual funds. And boy, that sounds good, right? Let's have some insurance here to protect you. And this is often called the M&E charge, and this can be over 1.25%. So let's go back to our favorite/least favorite company, Equitable. Every investment from them in their Equivest 201 series, which is their most popular product, and it's understanding they're revamping this, but as of today, that's their most widely sold product in the K-12 market. Every single investment starts with a 1.25% fee. Then if you want to add an S&P 500 fund, you're now paying 50 basis points, 0.56. And that's the thing. The sales agents will say to these people, and some might have a little bit of education. You know, a teacher might say, well, I want to be in the S&P 500. I want an index fund. Oh, we got an index fund for you. Here you go. It's the S&P 500 index. You know, they might have listened to your show. They might have read about, oh, that's a good way to invest. But they're maybe not being super forthcoming about insurance add-on charging 1.25%.
So there's a little bit of an element of caveat emptor here, a buyer beware. As you're describing essentially what is a sales pitch going on, it's something that in my interactions with the insurance industry in general, the 403B side, where there's this mix of insurance and 403Bs, like there's always a good pitch from the insurance industry, right? Whether it's you can get heaven without any hell, or how would you like to have insurance and get the upside of the markets at the same time? I mean, it sounds great until you peel back the onion and understand the math like you and I do. But if you're a teacher listening to this right now, what can you do to protect yourself, or what kind of path can you go down to make sure that you're in a good spot?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I should point out that we are a nonprofit. We sell no financial products. We are very lucky to be funded by a gentleman named Tim Ranzetta, who runs Next Gen Personal Finance. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this organization. And Tim does not want us trumpeting his name because he is just so low key. But Tim has this amazing mission. His goal is to get personal finance a required class for graduation in all 50 states. So far, to date, they've got 26 states, Jesse.
Cool.
Cool.
So
probably in about 2 or 3 years, it'll be implemented widely. It starts with personal finance education, and many teachers don't have this. They walk into the staff lounge and they are truly sitting ducks. So what I would tell any teacher listening, come to our website, 403bwise.org, join our Facebook group, read the books that you recommend. Jesse, I love your curated list of books. Psychology of Money is one of my favorite. The Morgan Housel podcast is genius. I enjoy his work so much. Our original idea with 403bwise.org was to call ourselves Inoculate, and we wanted to go to teacher education programs and reach teachers before they got in the classroom to, in effect, inoculate them against the disease that is what they face in the staff lounge by these sales agents. Unfortunately, I was a public school teacher for over a dozen years. I also taught college, and it is very hard to get college professors to give up a little bit of their time where we could come in and educate future teachers. I will tell you that last Friday, we spoke to 50 pre-service teachers at Southern Illinois University, and we gave them the lowdown. So those 50, it's a very small amount, now are educated and will be able to resist that sales pitch. But to your question, we have to be wise consumers in every aspect, whether we're buying a washer, a dryer, especially when it comes to financial products. Don't sign anything. Take the paperwork, say, thank you very much, I'll do my research. I think you had Money with Kate on. She's fantastic. She's a former teacher. There's a lot of us out there. Increasingly, teachers are getting into this sort of advocacy space. We think we do really good work, but we know we're not the only ones. The irony, Jesse, is it's education. Teachers need to learn about this stuff, unfortunately.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. One of the more common questions I hear is, Jesse, what do you like and use? Books, blogs, podcasts, even banks and brokerage firms. What are your recommendations? So to answer that question, I put together a webpage. You can check it out at bestinterest.blog/recommendations. Again, that's bestinterest.blog/recommendations to check out how I'm improving my financial life. And something, Dan, that you made me think about that is kind of interesting. This is a bit more of the nerdy financial planner in me, which is taking a step back to the whole annuity idea, where a lot of 403Bs are the money ends up in an annuity. Oftentimes you have a public school teacher who's already getting some form of state-sponsored pension, which is fixed income. Many are getting Social Security, which is fixed income. I think some states, actually, I learned this more recently, some states, if you have a public pension, you don't get Social Security, but that's a separate conversation. But either way, the idea is teachers are already getting a lot of good fixed income in retirement. And then what does the 403B advisor come in and say? Here's more fixed income for you through the annuity. So even if the annuity was low fee, which we know it's not, odds are it might not be a great fit from a financial planning point of view. I'm just from the 403B's organizational point of view, when it comes to that aspect of financial planning or like a tax planning or anything like that, do you have any tips or tricks for teachers to be aware of?
Well, you're exactly right. If you are a career public school teacher, you teach 30 years, your pension should provide anywhere from 40 to 60% of your final year's salary in retirement. Wow, what a nice, solid basis for a successful retirement. Layer on Social Security, but to your point, there's about, I think, 8 to 10 states. California is one of them, and I didn't realize this until maybe my third year. I wasn't paying into Social Security, and I was a career changer. So I had, maybe 5 years into the system, but, there's these pension offsets and other complexities. So you're right. Teachers have a lot of what we would call fixed income sources in retirement. So one school of thought, and again, everybody has to invest at their comfort level. So what I say may be right for me, not for everyone. I feel like teachers could let it ride. Just S&P 500 in your 403B, and I think you're fine, because then you've got the upside of the market and you've got this pension and Social Security to rely on. But you're right. The sales agents are going to sell what yields the biggest commission. My partner is really good about digging into disclosure documents, and this is horrifying. He found that equitable salespeople, in order, Jesse, to get health insurance and other benefits, have to sell a certain amount of equitable products. Could you imagine that? We always say, imagine if teachers, in order to get their health care, had to give X number of A's, X number of B's. The incentives are so perverse at that point.
You remind me, Dan, there's a great New York Times article, or I even think it was a series of articles, 3 or 4 or 5 articles that came out in a row. You're nodding your head. I mean, what is this in the last 5 or 8 years, something like that?
Well, this is what led us to Tim Ranzetta. So Scott, my partner, Scott Downhauer, and I were the lead sources for Tara and Ron Lieber, who did these articles, and we worked with them for over a year. They were constantly saying, this can't be right, because their frame of reference is the 401k, which has a risk of protection. And boy, that was a sensation for our movement, because I've been doing this for over 20 years. I originally launched the website way back in 2000 because I was getting sales agents coming into my staff lounge, coming into my classroom. I began to self-educate. We didn't have podcasts back then. We didn't have the internet. I was listening to the radio at, I think, 11 a.m. on Saturday mornings. I learned about Motley Fool. So I launched my website just to warn teachers way back then. But yeah, you are absolutely right. Those New York Times series of articles, I tell everyone, go search for those. We have them in our advocacy section of 403BYs.
We'll steal those links and throw them in the show notes here, because, I mean, I can picture some of the interviews in those articles with equitable advisors, or maybe former equitable advisors. And, it's Evan Jones, 27, of Bloomington, Indiana, who graduated with an economics degree, got a job at Equitable. For all he knew, here's a big firm. He's like, okay, cool. This is an interesting path. And throughout his training program, they're telling him, you are helping teachers. You are doing a good thing for teachers. This is a positive. And by the way, if you don't sell enough of our products, you don't get health insurance. So here's all these reasons why he ostensibly thinks he's doing right by these people. He's showing up in the break room, bushy-tailed young guy, box of donuts, talking to teachers. And it wasn't until a few years later when he realized, like, wait a second, he got, something's not quite right here. It's not that the advisors themselves are bad people.
I think people who are attracted to working with teachers are generally good people, if I had a broad brush it. And I think they experience exactly what you just described. They have an interest in personal finance. They hear about this opportunity. We've all graduated, not all of us, but I remember when I graduated from college, I was desperate to get that first job, right? They go to work for a company like an Equitable, and they're told all these sunny things like you. They go into the classroom, or they go into the staff lounges, they're establishing relationships. But as they begin to learn more, they might have a crisis of conscience. And I experienced this summer. Before we started recording, I mentioned I attended a wedding in the Woodstock, New York area. And one of the groomsmen was a former teacher who just got a job with a financial company. I'm not going to say the name. It wasn't Equitable. He and I started talking, and during the course of our conversation, you could see him start and mention red flags and red flags and red flags. And so we did a Zoom call about a month ago, and he just let me know he quit the company because he thought they were unethical. He's going back to teaching. He's going to earn his CFP and become a fiduciary advisor. So within our orbit, we have a lot of former Equitable salespeople who have come to us and said, you guys are 100% right. I want to do it the right way. What do you recommend? And they've gone down that, and many have successfully transitioned. We also have teachers. And again, we don't want to pull teachers out of the classroom because we need as many good teachers as we can. But we've worked with probably half a dozen teachers who have transitioned to becoming fiduciary advisors. Because frankly, you talk to 100 teachers, you talk to 100 Americans, I think it's not an exaggeration to say 90 of them would feel more comfortable talking to a trusted person. And we're not against advisors, not at all. But whose interest are they serving? That's why I love your title of your program. Somebody sent me these hats that say merely suitable and your best interest, right?
I like that. Explain to the audience, what does that refer to, Dan? Because I know the joke. I know the joke.
It's the type of advice you're getting. And a single advice. So you want someone who's working in your best interest, not someone who's, the minimum standard, something that's merely suitable. And what and what we've learned is that the same advisor might wear both hats in different situations. So one of our most popular resources is we have a fiduciary pledge on our website where we tell people, look, no problem, using advisor, but have them sign a fiduciary pledge, pledging to always put your interests first in all situations. Because we're starting to see Equitable advisors that have CFPs. Mm-hmm. And we found this very curious because you have to be a fiduciary, but we think there's ways that they can sort of skirt this.
I've told the story here on microphone on the podcast at least once, probably twice, of a former advisor at a firm like of one of the ones that we're talking about here, who, when he learned of my career transition and where I am at an independent RIA, the whole fiduciary standard, and he asked me one day, we're just having a coffee, and he goes, how often do you put your clients in annuities? Well, like I said, never so far. I said, we help 1,000 families. We've been around for 35 years. We've never found a reason where the math led us to selling an annuity for one of our clients, or even directing. I don't think we would have the ability to sell it here. We don't sell insurance products, even directing or advising an annuity. And he kind of twisted his forehead and looked at me, and he goes, you guys are fiduciaries and you've never sold an annuity? And I kind of looked at him and I said, well, you're a fiduciary, because he's a CFP. I said, you're a fiduciary and you do push annuities? So I hear what you're saying. It's a strange gray area that I don't have an answer to. I'm not sure if you do, Dan, or what your thoughts are.
I feel like the government on 2 occasions has tried to address that. And the most recent effort by the current administration, the Biden administration, was curtailed by annuity sales agents in Texas filing lawsuits. And there's a lot of court shopping that goes on. And they found friendly judge in Texas who has blown it up. And so once again, it seems so simple, right? Anyone selling financial products should put the client best interest first. What do you always say? Follow the money. I used to teach social studies. I feel like we have 4 branches of government, and the 4th is lobbyists. And I think that they are becoming more and more powerful. So to me, it's enormously frustrating. I feel like in our country, you are unbelievably vulnerable as a consumer. What gives me optimism is shows like yours. You look at TikTok, you look at all the social media platforms, and that cuts both ways, right? You've seen some absurd posts by people, whether it's Bitcoin or name the flavor of the month. But I do feel like it's very different than when I was in my 20s finding information. It's out there, and at some point, consumers have to be active in their own financial future.
In my opinion, Dan, I think there's more noise than ever before. Yeah. There's also more signal than ever before. One of my guiding principles is trying to provide as much signal as I can and trying to not provide any noise and hoping that people over time will come discover it. I mean, 403bwise, I think, is doing the same exact thing. And it's hard, but ultimately it's up. We hope that individuals can somehow find the work that we're doing or other people like us and start to realize that genuine signal. And maybe that brings me to my last question today, which is, I can imagine, and I just know for a fact of the way I'm going to share some of this conversation today with people, that teachers are going to tune in, some of whom have been going down a particular 403b path for 5 or 10 or 20 plus years. And they're going to hear what we've said today, and they're going to say, oh boy, I think I'm doing something in the red light district, as it were.
I love that. I'm going to use that.
And so the question is, if you're one of those teachers listening right now, Dan, where would you point them? How can they start to unwind, untangle, or head toward the green lights?
Fantastic question. So right from our homepage, middle left, it says stuck in a bad 403b, what you can do. Click that. We have detailed information. At the bottom of that page is a link specifically about Equitable, because we have a very active Facebook group, and I would urge your audience who's interested in this topic to join the 403bwise Facebook group. We are closing in on 18,000 members. The number one first post is, I was sold a 403b by company X. It's almost always Equitable. I've now learned how expensive this product is. How do I get out of it? We have amazing volunteers on that site. You have to register to be accepted. We don't take sales agents. We don't take financial planners. You have to be a 403b participant. You're going to get fantastic advice, not only from our volunteers, but also educators. They will say, stick with it. I got out of Equitable. Equitable, they're probably aware of us because they seem to be constantly changing the procedures. They put so many roadblocks in front of teachers. And so if you're a teacher listening right now and you have Equitable, here's what I would say. Number one, stop contributing. What do they say when you're in a hole? Stop digging. Just stop contributing. Okay, come to our website, look at that resource. Another resource we have is we are endeavoring to post as many school district 403b vendor lists as we can. So at the top of our page, you can select your state. You'll see a list of all the school districts in your state. To date, we have 5,000 school districts out of the more than 13,000 in our database, but we've focused on large school districts. So we think we have data covering over 60% of the teachers. Then see if you have a better option. See if you have one of these green vendors, one of these, even a yellow vendor isn't bad. So if we don't have that data, contact your school district and ask to see the 403b vendor list. And that's just the financial companies that are offered. If you want to come back to our site and upload that information, we will get it in our database and accessible. And this is what we do. Like on a daily basis, I'm uploading 5 to 10 new school districts. So what I did was before we started is Rochester City Public Schools, that's in the town you're in, right?
Yeah. I mean, a whole bunch of suburbs. Rochester up on your...
Yeah. So I uploaded it and they've earned a C because they have at least one low-cost vendor. Now, the problem is, most teachers in your city are not in the low-cost vendor, which is Aspire. This is that supermarket company that will give you access to Vanguard or Fidelity for only 0.15%. So again, Rochester, we'll just use a Rochester City teacher as an example. Stop contributing to Equitable, which is available. Take that new open up an account with Aspire, Vanguard through Aspire, and start putting the $200 or $300, whatever it is a month, into Aspire, not during the school year, because it's so complex. You can if you want to dedicate a weekend, but at some point, revisit your other product. And here's what's, again, so egregious. They do a rolling surrender charge. So if you've been contributing for like 10 years and you stopped 10 years ago, you can move all the money penalty free. But every new monthly contribution begins a new 7 to 10 year period. People get so angry at their school district for allowing this, at themselves. And we always tell teachers, don't beat yourself up. You didn't know what you didn't know. Now, if they listen to this podcast and then sign up with Equitable, we can't help you.
Yeah. Well, you remind me, I'll have to send you this link offline, Dan, or I'll throw it in the show notes for listeners. I was helping a family member move her assets from a Lincoln 403b and just to roll it over into a self-managed IRA. And the process for her to do so was so convoluted with multiple forms back and forth and medallion stamps and notarizations and all this different stuff. This is like kind of an inside baseball thing from content creation. There's this saying, the medium is the message, that this social scientist, Canadian guy, Marshall McLuhan, said in the 60s, medium meaning like media, TV versus internet versus Instagram versus podcasts. And his whole idea is, well, if I'm trying to send a certain message, it's going to be received differently if it's coming through TikTok than if it's coming through a podcast or if it's coming through a Facebook post. Like there's a certain underlying message in the media choice itself. Well, I took that idea and I said the friction is the message. Because a lot of times in financial interactions, if a company will very easily accept your money, but then will add a lot of friction if you want to get your money back, they're sending a certain message there. And there's a reason why the rollovers in the Vanguard and Fidelity and Schwab world are extremely easy compared to the rollovers in this 403b world, because there's a certain message that they're sending with that added friction. And you just reminded me of that. We've covered a lot of very valuable ground today, Dan, and I'm sure listeners will have a pretty good idea of where to go. But whether it's the Facebook group specifically or your website, how can our listeners today reach out to you or access some of these resources that you and your partner put together?
Yeah, absolutely. Come to the website, 403bwise.org, join the Facebook group. If you're new to this and you want to share this information with your colleagues, we do 2 podcasts. We do a weekly, we call it Teach and Retire Rich. It's a tongue-in-cheek name. It has to do with the intrinsic rewards of being a teacher. That's accessible from our homepage, as is a special podcast series that we had produced called Learn by Being Burned. It lays out how teachers around the country were burned, how they learned, and how they started advocating for change. And we think it is a powerful way to educate educators about the problems of the 403b and the solutions.
Fantastic.
Oh, and I was going to say, if you want to reach us, at the very top, it says contact. Email will come right to me. Also, hello@403bwise.org. Another thing we do is we have self-paced free learning modules. So from our events section, if you were to click events at the top of our homepage, at the top of that page that launches, it'll say on-demand learning modules. We have one on the 403b, a second 401k-like retirement plan available to teachers called the 457b. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this, especially for someone in New York. The state of New York has the single best state-run 457B plan called New York Deferred Compensation. Every school district in New York should make this available. And if I was a teacher in New York and it was available, that's where my first dollar of contribution would go, the 457 over the 403B. So that's what I would do there. And then also, I think a Roth IRA for every teacher is maybe where you should begin because it's not tied to your employer. If you change school district or change careers, you don't have to deal with it. We think that is a good way to go, a Roth IRA.
Fantastic. Fantastic stuff today, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us. So Dan Otter of 403B Wise, we will make sure that listeners can find all these resources you've detailed today. And thank you again for joining us here on the Best Interest Podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about something you can see I'm very passionate about.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Best Interest Podcast. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email at jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves, and we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Best Interest Podcast. The Best Interest Podcast is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice and is not prescriptive of your financial situation.